Hello, welcome to our D1 student panel. My name is Noelle Hale, and I'm the director of the Napa Valley Wine Academy's WSET Diploma program. And today I'm going to be joined by three students who recently passed D1 and their D1 exams. And so we're going to hear about some of their experiences learning about viticulture and winemaking and what advice they would give other students beginning their WSET diploma journey. So first, I'd like to give everyone a chance to introduce themselves. And so, Joe, it looks like you're next to me on the screen here. So I'm just going to start with you if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Great. I'm Joe Edelman. I am not in the wine industry. I'm actually a veterinarian who focuses on emergency and critical care. But I've always had an interest in food and wine, and I even worked at a certain winery in central Missouri that Noelle may know from Rocheport when I was in college. So this is a great way for me to learn more about wine and hopefully one day enter the wine industry.
Cool, thank you. And for viewers who don't know, I went to high school and college in Missouri, and Joe actually went to the same high school that I did, so which is small world. So yeah, anyway, okay, well then I'm going to thank you, Joe. I'm going to keep going around the circle here. And so Christina, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Christina Sayon. So I do work in the wine industry currently at Jackson Family Wines. I have a dual role. I am an attorney, so doing contract work, winery things. But I also work in production in California at Verite Winery up on Chalk Hill, and spend a lot of time in France at our French property Chateau Le Sègue in Saint-Emilion.
Very cool. Thank you. And then Billy, last but very much not least, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you. Man, Christina is a force to be reckoned with. But just to introduce myself, my name is Billy Ralla. I work in the hospitality side of the industry. So I work in trade relations, which is working with our sales side as they bring guests into our wineries, and also our educational programs for Foley family wines.
Cool. Well, thank you guys. And yeah, I invited everybody because I was trying to get a group who had recently passed D1, but also, from a variety of different professional career tracks, really, because we do get students from all over, some of whom who work in the wine industry, some of whom don't at all. And so, just to kind of prove the point that you don't have to necessarily work in the wine industry to be able to succeed in these kinds of courses. So thank you all for joining. And so just to recap really quick for anybody who is listening but may not know, D1 is the first unit in the WSET Level 4 Diploma program. And so that's the WSET's flagship program. The whole thing takes about 2 to 3 years to complete. And the first unit covers viticulture and winemaking. And so that's kind of be what we're sort of talking about today. And so Christina, I know, has some winemaking experience, but as far as I know, well, I guess Joe, you said you have a little bit too. Billy, do you have any hands-on production experience or?
Yeah, I did work a harvest.
Oh, okay. Oh, cool. So you all do then. Okay, well, cool. Well, what I was gonna get at was that you don't have to have worked in production either to be able to succeed at this exam. But that's awesome that all of you have some experience. So, okay. Well, one of the things when I talk to students that I hear a lot is that people are kind of nervous or intimidated about the first unit because it does cover viticulture and winemaking. And so did any of you feel that way headed into D1?
I did. I mean, I had zero, other than when I worked in college at the winery. I had no experience doing this. And then I got the textbook, which was a lot. And so I felt a bit overwhelmed. But I think that I was able to finally get a grasp on the generalization of things and prior to the test, and so I felt prepared.
Okay. Well, we're going to get to that. So,
So I was going to say, to be, super transparent, the test itself can be intimidating, the formatting of it, and really having to pay attention to the wording of questions and knowing how to take the test. So I was definitely nervous about that. And we can talk more about ways to kind of get over that hump of being nervous.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, so it sounds like, I mean, Billy, were you kind of aware of that coming from level 3? Because I know it's a little bit different in the diploma, but like at level 3, you have those short written answer questions, and sometimes people get really freaked out about those.
I, I wasn't freaked out about level 3. I feel like this one was there was a bit more emphasis on wording and really making sure that you're able to stay on track with the question in the amount of time that you have. So that's, I think,
Yeah.
the biggest stress. It's the biggest stress for me.
Okay. Yes. Well, I am going to ask. I am going to get into that a bit in a little
Yeah.
bit. But Christina, how did you feel kind of headed into D1?
I mean, it really is my, kind of primary work area. So I felt pretty comfortable, to be honest, as some of you may, if you work in production, with a lot of the basics of, viticulture and vinifications. I think for me, I was more unsure just about starting the program, the process, how to best prepare, how to organize my time, and just kind of, sort of gradually onboarding into the diploma, I think were things I had more hesitations about.
Okay. Well, cool. Okay, so we had kind of a range, which I think is very normal. So um, that sounds good. Okay, and we're going to get into some of these things that you guys touched on in just a little bit. So, I mean, the next thing I'm kind of wondering about is, you kind of get into D1, you start learning the material, you get into a little bit of a groove, hopefully. And so I'm kind of wondering, when you were doing your studies from week to week, what did your routine as far as when you studied look like?
So I have
Uh,
3 kids on top of work, so finding a schedule and setting a schedule is so important. As soon as I enrolled for the class, I started outlining the chapters. I'm so old school. I have a little planner that where I plan out my days. I wake up at 5:30 and I try to get as much done before the kids wake up, and then I have to work. So I think having a schedule, setting boundaries in your life, and prioritizing. Because if this is, we love studying wine. That's why we're here. So you can prioritize the time in your life, no matter how hectic it may be.
Yeah. And how long, every like on average, I guess, because I know it can vary depending on scheduling and stuff, but on average, how much per day did you feel like you were studying? Joe.
I study every day. I do an hour to 2 hours every day. That's just
Okay.
how I set up my schedule.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. And then who
Probably about an hour or two, really every day. And of course, sometimes things come up. You're not going to hit that 100%. But if you don't get behind, that doesn't become an issue. For me, what was really important was to really outline the full. So I'm a lawyer. So law school, me lives by outline. So I outlined the entire textbook, and in a pretty detailed outline, and once I had outlined it, I did not go back to the text unless I had a question. I had everything in my own materials. And so then I tried to outline, study, do the worksheets for the current topic before class. That was really important to me. I feel like the class should be ideally review, and consolidation and a chance to ask questions. I found that I integrated the material so much better that way than just coming into class and seeing those things for the first time.
Yeah, I agree. It makes it easier. I think both when you're the student and honestly when you're the instructor as well, when students come to class and, even if you don't have everything fully clear yet, but, if you've gone through the material enough to where you kind of understand some of it, and you've been able to figure out, okay, what are the things I actually don't understand yet that I maybe do have questions about. Yeah, it's very helpful for everyone, I think. So, okay, well, cool. And then Billy, how did your weeks kind of shape up?
So I'll give a different perspective of someone who, those of us who are a little less structured in our lives, in our day. I can dive into a project for hours and hours and hours. I like things to be a little bit more fluid in my schedule, just because I have so many pieces going on. So just to give you a little background, I do work, I travel a lot with my job. So you're fitting in travel. Sometimes I'm working 4 days, sometimes I have, a couple days, 3 days off. I also dance about 3 hours every night. And then try to have a social life and hang out with my family in between. So I feel like my life is just trying to fit things into pockets. And if your life happens to be somewhat like that, the way it worked best for me is just integrating study into every part of my day and my life. And it could be in little ways. It could be sitting down to study for an hour or two. A lot of the things, like going the notes, a detailed outline, and then not going back to the text after you've done that. I used to be a teacher, so I tried to integrate all 3 learning styles: audible, visual, and haptic. And so I'll talk about sort of how I did that in my studies, but that would mean if I'm driving 2 hours somewhere, I'm listening to podcasts on the subjects. Listening to, reviewing again, going back over webinars, because they're all recorded for you. So you can go back and listen to them again. And that refreshes your memory there. When I'm at the gym, I like to go to the gym during the day. I bring my note cards with me. And in between sets, I go and review note cards. So if you don't have the time or the mental bandwidth to sit down and have 5 to 7 a.m. study time every day, integrating it into the places where you can is a really great way to unpurposefully get in 2 to 3 hours of study each day.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I mean, I think, finding time sometimes can be tricky. And the idea of, okay, oh man, I got to sit down and study for 2 hours sometimes is enough to just like make you want to go hide. But, even if you are able to do 15 minutes in the morning and 15 minutes in the evening, that's still 3.5 hours, every week right there. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be these big, long marathon study sessions. Exactly. I agree. Well, that kind of brings me.
I would say also, kind of piggybacking on what Noah was saying, quality really counts more than quantity. I would fixate less on how many hours I got than spending that time really focused, prioritizing active methods of learning rather than kind of flipping through your notes a million times. So it's a good guideline, but I think really prioritizing really active, focused study is more important than, the number of minutes you're doing per day.
Yeah. Well, it makes me happy to hear all of you talk, because these are things that I tell students too. So
I agree totally with everyone on that. I do think repetition for me, being a bit older, is important. So even though I'm not active studying, 1 to 2 hours a day, I'm sitting at my desk at lunch, just flipping through note cards, because just that seeing those words over and over again, it just gets stuck in my head, and it really helps to retain the information. And I think that's important for like older studiers like me, who's in their 40s now. It doesn't come as easy at this point, so I have to really focus and repeat over and over again.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, if there are students out there who are in the industry in any way, really immersing yourself in the material and bringing it into your daily job, I feel like helps it become less a memorization and more of a learning how. And so if you're at a vineyard, going into the vines and looking at the vines, seeing if you're seeing any viruses in there, right? Applying what you've learned. If you're in the hospitality side, talking to winemakers, reading through wine notes and seeing how they're actually using what you're learning in the textbook in the real world. And then in that information, sharing it with guests is going to really solidify it in your brain, because you learn best through teaching rather than just learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to kind of build on what you all have said, and something I tell students sometimes too is that unfortunately, as adults, we're not just the little sponges we were in school anymore, and we don't just soak up knowledge effortlessly, unfortunately. And so it takes a little more work to learn new things as an adult. And like Joe was saying, repetition can be helpful, but also that idea of active learning. And so if you're listening and you've never heard that term before, instead of reading a page in the book and you're just sort of passively going through it, and then you get to the bottom of the page and maybe you don't remember much of what you read anymore, right? That's a very passive way of studying. And so instead of doing that, think about ways you can really engage your brain with the material, right? And so maybe instead of reading the whole page, you read just one section of the page and then stop and think about it and ask yourself, okay, do I understand this? Could I explain it to someone else? What questions do I have? How does this relate to what I just read yesterday? And so like taking those pauses to actually process what you're reading, or maybe pausing to, write some notes that way, something like that, really helps you start putting the material in your own words. And of course on exam day it's going to have to come out of your brain in your own words anyway, so the sooner you can do that, the better. But yeah, this is amazing advice, you guys. Thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask everybody is, and I don't know the answer to this from you guys, but did any of you feel like you had to change anything about how you were studying at the beginning of D1 versus like as you got into it more and the weeks went by?
100%. Yes.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Yeah. So, before we were relying on old study skills from school, you're reading through, you're kind of taking notes to gain as much information as you can. But as you start to do the practice exams and get into the advice on how to answer those questions, it kind of had me go back and start to change the way I was taking notes. Instead of just taking notes on all the information, I would do little sections where I did threats versus opportunities for each topic. And I would do look at my notes as more of a prep for answering questions rather than just trying to catalog information.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. Christina or
For me, it was
Joe?
mind maps. For me, it was mind maps. I never used mind maps before. I thought they were silly. And then I realized, no, these are helpful. Like with the diseases, if you write the word ESCA down and you write everything you know about ESCA, it really tells you what you don't know about that disease. Or in other chapters of the D1 textbook, it really is helpful. And so I tried different modalities. So I've always been just a note taker. I rewrite everything, outline. I did note service in school, so it helped to retain when I actually wrote the notes down in my own words. But then I started using note cards because they were compact and I could take them anywhere. And I did mind maps and I did practice questions. I made up my own questions, which was really helpful because then I could truly see how my knowledge base was in certain categories of the textbook. So yeah, as Billy said, it evolves as you study. You're always, I think, overzealous at the beginning, and you have all of these dreams about how you're going to study, and then they change. And by the time you're done, it's completely different than how you started. So it's an evolution when you're studying for the diploma text.
Absolutely. Christina, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, kind of on similar themes, I mean, I also started and did continue to take just very detailed outline, really strict notes off of the book. But I think what I did integrate as I went further along was writing out almost just like practice answers. So instead of, I would have my outline on like, what is Pierce's disease? But then I would actually take a piece of paper and like force myself to write out as if it was an exam question, what is Pierce's disease? And then where I find I really got my money's worth with that technique is you correct it from your outline or from the book. You turn the page and from memory, you write it again. And then the next morning, all of the questions that you answered the previous, you do it again from memory. And then if you have to add in more little corrections, you do it again. And the next day you repeat. So for me, I integrated really more writing as I went along, because I realized that for me, the passive mastery, creating the switch over into active use it was something really important. And kind of similarly to Joe, I had never used any of these like memory palace, whatever tricks before, but there were a few subjects that things I just really hadn't experienced before in real life that really truly were almost like rote memorization for me and just impossible to just remember. And I did for certain things like some of the diseases, some of the pests, create sort of little mind palace, images. The guy is like a sharpshooter and he's holding a thing, he's by a stream, and you create a whole visual picture. And that can be a really good shortcut if there's something that has a lot of really intricate parts that really is kind of rote memorization otherwise. And that's something that I had never done before and kind of helped me.
That's cool. Well, that actually leads really nicely into the next question I wanted to ask you guys. And maybe Christina, will start with you. But what did you feel like the toughest subject was for you to really be able to wrap your head around?
For me, and I think for some of my classmates too, I think some of the pests and diseases, if you haven't seen them before, if you haven't been actively involved with them professionally, I just found it really tough to remember all the details, all the causes, all of the effects, all of the signals in the vines, because for each of those there could be something, from 5 to maybe even 10 separate little items that are each worth a point that they're looking for. And if you don't have experience with it in the real world, I found those things really tough to remember. Yeah, and so I did integrate some of my memory palace tricks for a few of those.
Yeah, very cool. And I'm trying to remember, maybe one of you guys remember the name. If you're hearing this term memory palace and you're like, what the heck is that? There's a book. There's a book. What's it called? I can't remember. But basically the idea is kind of like creating like mnemonics for yourself, or basically shortcuts to memorize things that are, like, you memorize a saying or something, and then that actually helps you remember the 10 crews of Beaujolais, or whatever, something like that. Um, different kind of tricks for getting to memorize things. And so it's a book about a guy who decided he wanted to start entering like memory competitions where people have to memorize the order of cards in a deck, or memorize a random string of numbers or something like that. And so if you Google the term memory palace, you'll probably find some articles and things about techniques like that maybe help remember some of these more complicated types of things. But
I would
anyway,
say, and this is like maybe your mileage may vary with this, so take this with a grain of salt, but I actually found for the topics for me that were hardest to remember, I actually went more out of scope of the text. So the WSET text is excellent in that it's very concise, it is very organized, but it's also quite dry and the language is repetitive. And so if you don't have experience with something and context for it, it can actually sometimes be hard to retain all those little details. So if you're having a lot of trouble with a certain topic like pests or diseases, Get on YouTube, get on Guildsong, watch some videos about what it looks like, hear some winemakers talking about it. I feel like going out of the scope of the text for certain things actually did help me really to kind of get the bigger picture and then retain some of those details.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And oh, go ahead. Was that Billy? Go for
I
it.
was going to say that's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, pests and diseases still, as I'm going through D3, I keep to my notes. I'm like, wait, which one again? They're so confusing because they're so similar in some ways. But one of the examples that I was having a hard time with in the textbook was the different filtration systems that I hadn't seen in action before. And the textbook, I feel like looking back, once I knew more about it, gave a good description, but it doesn't really bring it to life in a way that you're going to be able to easily memorize it. And so what I would do is go to manufacturers or sales teams websites for those devices and watch their promo videos. And once I saw the machines in action, I was like, this makes so much more sense. I don't have to memorize anything. I just have to describe what I just saw. So like Christina said, reaching out, watching those videos outside of the text, seeing it in action makes it, again, become more applicable to what you're seeing in the world. It becomes less of a memorization issue of how do I describe what I now know?
Absolutely. And well, that's exactly what my example was going to be was filtration because
Okay.
I think yeah, like if you've seen a huge, depth filter with diatomaceous earth before, well, cool, then you can probably explain it. But if you're trying to figure out how it works from the description in the book, or you're trying to figure out, well, how does a plate and frame filter work from the description in the book, it's really hard. And so, yeah, I do think there can be some cases, where trying to get a visual on something in the book through YouTube particular is where I usually tell people to go, can be really helpful. So yeah, I know, but I at the same time, yeah, the book is solid, and I always try and be careful that about recommending too many things outside of the book, because technically, yes, the book does contain everything you need to know to pass the exam, but my caveat is that sometimes having that extra little bit of context can help you really understand something if you've never come across it before. So yeah, exactly. So Joe, what about you? What did you find really tricky?
I agree with all of them. I thought the vineyard management was most difficult because I wasn't working in a vineyard. So when do you apply sulfur dioxide? How is it applied? What forms does it come in? Like all those were questions to me, for me. We're a musical family. I was going to bring this up, and so I made up songs and had my kids sing with me for remembering certain things. No, I will not sing them, but
I was going to ask.
but it helps my kids to learn, and it helps me to learn. When you have that song in your head at the test, you're like, oh gosh, I know that. So but I also have a research background, so I know the filtration methods. I've used those in labs before. I do a lot of PubMed research. So when I would come across a topic that I didn't understand, I would look at research articles that talked about it. In D2, I use wine business a lot, so I could see application of those business techniques. So I think external resources are really helpful if you really want to know the information. If you're just here to pass a test, read the textbook, you'll be fine. But if you really want to know the information, I think you need to look at external resources.
Yeah, fair enough. So cool. Well, thank you guys. Let's see. So then I know you guys, some of you have mentioned this already, but one thing I want to talk about is that I hear from students quite a lot that this idea of exam technique in D1 is a lot more important than they thought it was going to be. And so by that, I mean that when you take a diploma exam, for example, the D1 exam is 90 minutes. And maybe that sounds like a lot of time, but it flies by. And so the amount you are expected to write when you answer exam questions is quite a bit. Um, and so it creates a lot of time pressure, which can create a lot of stress during the exam. And so part of, being successful on the D1 exam is, figuring out how do you break through this paralysis, this feeling of paralysis sometimes. Like when you open that exam booklet and look at the questions, it's sometimes you can totally feel like, oh my gosh, do I even know anything about wine? I don't know anything about wine. Why am I even here? And it's this horrible feeling. And so we do try to help, students work through that and make people aware of it because it does happen. Um, and so one of the things that, we try and emphasize is that the way the WSET asks its questions is really important. And it truly is this skill that people usually have to practice. And I think that catches people off guard, sometimes this idea of, oh, when they ask you to describe something versus explain something, it kind of gives you clues that mean, those words mean different things, and so did any of you guys feel like that caught you off guard, or how did you work on that?
I was super thankful for the document that that you guys provide on how to sort of address those key terms, discuss versus explain versus evaluate, but also the breakdown of time. Because what that did is, by having that structure, when I went in to take the test, I immediately did a math equation and broke down how much time I had for each question. And then each question with that amount of time, 10 minutes, and it said describe. I knew that I only had to describe and evaluate or explain, which would be a longer answer. And so it really helped me to focus on management. So then, instead of worrying about all of the millions of things I could say, I was able to give more quality time to giving, I think, a better. So I could focus just on my information. And it took a lot of that stress away to have that structure available to me. I would say I did a lot of studying. I would say 85% of my studying before I read that document. And if I had not read it, I don't think I would have passed the first test. So I'm so glad it made me completely change my way of thinking, and it made exam day much less stressful. And really, you use every second. And I've taken 2 tests now, and from start to finish, I'm to get that sentence in.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the document Billy is talking about is one that is available to all registered diploma students. It's published by the WSET, and it's called their theory guidance document or something like that. And basically, it goes through the different types of what they call command verbs. So, like, I mentioned describe is different than explain, and those are different than compare. And so it goes through exactly how they use each of those terms and kind of helps you figure out, okay, this is what they're asking me to do, and so basically just trying to it can be frustrating sometimes because the questions are so specific, right? But the flip side of that is I really do think they try to be specific so that they give you clues on what they're looking for, right? It's just sort of like this code that you sort of have to unlock. And that document, I know it's like one of those things where you read it at the beginning and a lot of it's probably going to go over your head, and then but if you like wait a month or two and read it again, then you're going to be like, oh. And I mean, I still refer back to that when advising students because it just really is a helpful document. It's so dense and just packed full of little helpful bits. But absolutely.
Yeah, and don't have the hubris where you're like, oh, I've taken tests before. I don't need these helpful tips. You do. You need it for this test.
Yeah. They are not easy tests. I will give you that. Absolutely. Let's see, Christina, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree with that. I have done a lot of school. I've done a lot of tests. So I don't consider myself someone who has, a blockage with test taking per se. But I think the thing to remember is that the WSET exams are being given all over the world. Hundreds of people are taking the exact same exam at the same time. And what they're looking for is actually really, really structured. Like it's almost formulaic. And once you realize that, I think the other document that I wish I had relied on more sooner is the specification, where they really lay out all the testing out. I can't remember the testing outcomes or whatever they call it. And it's almost like a plug and chug of the kind of possible questions you could be asked. So what you're being asked is actually quite structured. It's quite specific, as Noelle says, and that can feel like a little constraining. But I do feel like it takes a little bit of the stress away, because you just sort of have to crack the code of what they're looking for via understanding the question types, understanding the learning outcomes from the specification that I'm sure you'll all see as you go along that they're testing on. And that gives you a lot more confidence that you don't feel like you're going in, and just sort of like freewheeling it. You're really working in a structure. And that I think can be a little comforting as well.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can get to the point where you feel that way about the question wordings, then that is fantastic. So, absolutely. And so, yeah, trying to think about it in terms of, oh, wow, these questions, they sure are specific, but, it can actually help you, right? Because it helps you narrow down the scope of what you're trying to, what you need to say, right? And so, and let's see, I think also the diploma specification, I believe, is available to the public. So that theory guidance document, maybe it's out there on the internet, I'm not sure, but I think it may be behind kind of like the registration paywall essentially, but the specification, I believe you could Google WSET Diploma specification level 4 or something, and I bet you should be able to pull it up. And so, if you are just starting your D1 journey, or you're thinking about starting the diploma and you're kind of wondering, well, what are we going to learn about? That can be a useful thing. So anyway, okay, Joe, what are your thoughts on exam technique?
Billy and Christine are spot on with everything. It is formulaic. You just have to figure it out. I come from a field that multiple choice testing is all I've done. And so I can take a multiple choice test like nothing, but the essay questions are a little more challenging. And so when you're learning the 200 pages in D1 or so, 200 some pages, and you're being asked 3 or 4 questions, you really have to be prepared for it. And so I always go back to what you told us on our last day of class in D1. If you don't know, write style, quality, and price at the top of your paper, and that will help you to figure it out. And so every test I take for WCT, I write style, quality, price at the top. I write the action verbs, and I go from like identify down to evaluate, because every time you go down, you have to add more information. And when I get to a question that says identify, I know I'm just going to write down what it is. If I'm evaluating, it's going to be a lot. I'm going to be writing. I'm going to be defining things. I'm going to be giving examples of everything. So I think knowing those action verbs, preparing yourself. So when you get to that test and they say you may start, write down style, quality, price, your action verbs, and outline everything you want to do before you actually write. I think you'll be successful.
Yeah. Yeah, and to reference that piece of advice, I guess really 3 things that come up over and over again in the diploma program are, how does whatever thing you're learning about affect the style, quality, and price of a given wine, right? And so that's actually a trick I tell students, that like, if you are one of those people where you open the exam booklet and you're like, oh my gosh, your mind just goes blank, because I am one of those people myself, and so this is very much from a place of personal experience. Okay, stop for a second, take a deep breath, and go to whatever question you want to start with. And if you feel like you can't remember anything about pruning methods or whatever, okay, then start thinking about, okay, pruning methods. How do they affect the style of a wine, right? And or the quality or the price of a wine, right? And see if you can kind of get your brain, like the wheels starting to turn again. And that usually helps you like break through that feeling of, oh my gosh, I don't remember anything. And then you're rolling, and it's like once you get going, you do remember a whole lot. You just have to kind of get to that point of, the thoughts are flowing, right? Well, so one thing I also wanted to ask you guys is based on another, piece of advice we give pretty frequently, which is this idea of, doing like a mind map or a short little outline or jotting down some form of notes or road map on the exam for some of the questions. And, because that can really help you, figure out, okay, what do I need to say in this question, right? And it kind of goes back to that idea of there is this sort of code, but it's kind of formulaic, right? And so figuring out before you start writing and get into your answer, what are the little check the boxes I need to check with what I write, and then also because we talked about that time pressure, and it can be pretty stressful. You start writing, and then you kind of get midway through your answer sometimes, and you're like, wait a minute, I'm not answering the question anymore. What was I supposed to be talking about? And then you can go back to your little, notes or whatever you scribbled out and be like, oh, okay, here's where I need to get back on track, because you've done the thinking beforehand. And I mention this because that idea of taking that, minute or 2 minutes to plan out some answers, particularly some of the higher weighted questions, it can feel scary because you're not getting words on the page, immediately, right? But sometimes that can actually save you time and save you stress, later on in the exam. And so I'm curious if any of you adopted that as an approach or sort of how you tackled, answering the questions on exam day.
I mean, yeah, I would even say, and again, your mileage may vary with this, depending on, how you operate in test conditions. But I spent more than a minute or two. A caveat that for a smaller weighted question, that's like Joe was saying, just an identify, like say what this is. I don't think this is worthwhile as much. But if it's a 45-minute question, so 50% weighting in the D1, I would probably spend 5 minutes writing a detailed like paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, every single point, because you see this over and over in the examiner's reports. One of their most common complaints is it's really, really easy to start going off track and kind of brain dumping everything you know about a topic, which results in 0 points. And so I really find like having a very detailed, so then when you start to get like a little rushed, especially near the end, you're just really going back like, okay, and now I'm talking about this and this and this and this and this and this. And I found that really helped me stick to structured answers. Although, of course, as Noelle said, it can be a little unnerving to watch those, minutes tick by and you don't have anything on the page.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should probably clarify too that the way the diploma exams are structured, if you haven't taken any yet, is that basically you have, here's the question, and then it's given a certain percentage weighting. And so you can use those weighting percentages to figure out how long you should spend answering each question, right? So if it's total out of 100%, well, you have 90 minutes. So if a question is weighted 50%, you're going to spend 45 minutes on it, if that makes sense, right? So, I mean, you can kind of figure the math out in your head however you like, depending on how much you like math. But, it just sort of keeps you on track. And so there's this idea of if a question's weighted 50%, you're going to be writing a lot, versus something that's weighted 5 or 10% might just be a sentence or two, So anyway, okay, thank you, Christina. Billy or Joe, any thoughts on outlines or exam weightings?
I am a huge fan of jotting down words. So I have the topic, I first circle the command verbs, and I underline the important nouns in the prompt. So I know exactly what topic I'm covering. And then I just sort of get in my head and say, okay, what do I absolutely need to cover on this? And I might do 2 columns if we're comparing things. If it's multiple paragraphs and we're addressing different topics, then I'll do different columns of, and that will give me my rough outline. I don't do any formal structure to it. I just want to get a paper so that I can confidently look over and kind of know where I am as I'm writing my answer. And the other thing I do is I hate watches. I never wear watches, which is why I'm probably late to everything. But I always have a watch in front of me during this exam. And I've had to buy now on the way to exams because I keep forgetting them. Luckily, there's Targets nearby. And I have my watch. They have clocks in there, but I like to have it right in front of me as I go. So I get that question. I kind of do a quick math. Oh, I have 10 minutes. I have 15 minutes for this. I allot, if it's 10 minutes, maybe a minute to write down words. If it's 30 minutes, maybe 3 minutes. And I try to be really strict to that and just dump as much as I can. And then I start going into the essay. And as I keep an eye on that clock and say, I really need to move on to the noun now, and really try to just bust it out and make sure I'm staying on time. Because that's really, I think, the biggest stress to this test is trying to get everything you need to say down within the allotted time.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because everyone's worst nightmare is running out of time, and that's why the weightings can be so important. Because usually, if I talk to a student who, has an issue where they didn't pass D1, it comes down to some of this exam technique stuff, right? And maybe they ran out of time, or maybe, they didn't answer the question in the way the examiners were hoping for, right? And so, because a lot of times people put in the work for D1, and I talk to a lot of students who sometimes people end up quite shocked that they didn't pass. And it's not because they didn't know the material, it's that the material didn't end up on the page in the way the examiners were looking for, right? And so that's kind of why we're talking about some of this stuff. So exactly. And I did also want to say too that as far as watches go, if you have a dumb watch, so not an Apple Watch, or something that you can has an internet connection, you can have it on your desk, like Billy was saying. So, and there should be clocks in the exam room, but sometimes it's easier to have a small one right next to you. So anyway, okay,
and
cool.
pro tip I carry with me from law school, set it 90 minutes to midnight. So it's so visually, so much more, it jumps really out at you that you see that you're counting down to midnight, not like it's 2:45 or whatever. But if you have 90 minutes, then you set your watch for 10:30 and you see the hands come in on midnight.
Oh, interesting.
Just
Okay.
a thought.
Cool. Thank you. Well, Joe, what about you?
So I'm not as organized with their prep before test as they are, but I write style, quality, price at the top. I write my action verbs. I do tick boxes, so I know that I'm going to define things and I'm going to give examples. And I want to make sure I've done that. So when I finish a question, I check off that I did that. And then I also like to, for D1, not so much for D2, but for D1, I made a little table of processes, winemaking and vineyard management processes. So I made sure I talked about everything. Because
cool.
you're gonna miss stuff. You're not gonna get everything you want to get into that question. And so it'll kind of hedge my bets if I have those words in front of me and I can look back and say, oh, I didn't talk about that. So I better go back and talk about it. I'm a big footnote person. So when they regrade my tests, there are going to be so many footnotes in there. Because I go back and I figured, oh, I forgot to write that in. So
yeah, no, and
I always give myself 5 minutes at the end. I always make sure I have 5 minutes at the end just to make certain I wrote what I wanted.
Yeah. I was going to say that the footnotes is a really smart piece of advice to share too, because sometimes, what the examiners don't want is if you realize you forgot something, for you to try and scribble it in the margins on your paper, because then your writing's all tiny and they can't read it and it's impossible to write. And so instead, what they want you to do is go to where you realize you want to include something else and make a footnote. So you write the number 1, circle it, then go to the bottom of your page or the next page or whatever, write your number 1, circle it, and then write those sentences that you want to include right there. and they'll just, oh, okay, got it, this fits in right there. And that's how they want you to handle that, so that they can read your answer and then they can give you points for it. So yeah, very smart. Cool. Okay, so let me see. And then one other thing I wanted to ask you guys is that we have a new D1 cohort. They're starting next week. So I wanted to ask everybody, if you had to give one piece of advice to someone just starting D1, what would it be? Joe, you want to start?
Sure.
Or you just have to think?
We've alluded to a lot of these things like scheduling and keeping to a schedule, but for me, it goes by so fast. I'm in D4 and D6 right now, so it flew by. You just have to enjoy it, and as much as you want to do well on these tests, you want to get all this information down. We're talking about fermented grape juice, and so just enjoy studying and tasting and learning all of this wonderful information.
That's good advice. Yeah, that's the nice thing about studying wine, is that you can do it with a glass in hand, right? So, absolutely. Billy, what about you?
Mine kind of goes along with that. If you're doing the diploma, likely you're doing it because you have a passion for wine. It's not something that's just, a fun hobby to do. It's a big exam, and it's, 2 to 3 years that you're dedicating to it. So immerse yourself in it, right? Get the most you can. It is an exam and you're trying to pass it to get a certification, but you're also trying to get the information. So immerse yourself in it every way that you can. And that will make studying easier, whether that's, looking up videos, or if you're listening to podcasts with, winemakers in the industry, pull some of the things that you're learning about from the exam from what they're saying. If you can go to a vineyard and walk through it and see how they're pruning, and kind of go through your brain, your visual note cards, and be like, oh, they are doing this sort of pruning, and this will resist style of wine, price point, right? Make it part of your daily life. If you can't go to a vineyard, draw picture notes of different pruning techniques, right? Don't just write down notes and try to remember. Try to make it a little as immersive as you can in every part of your life, because that's really the point of this, is to get knowledge and a deeper understanding of everything wine.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then Christina, one piece of advice.
Yeah, really similar. I think I would just say, remember your why. Remember why you're there. It can sometimes be a slog sometimes to study at 5:30 in the morning, as Joe does, but it's a really fun subject, and it's a really fun group. So, when you're having a glass of wine, think about it. Think of all the work and all the people's expertise that went into it and are behind it. Tie it back to what you're learning. And remember, it's a beautiful industry to be a part of, to participate in, and it's fun to be here.
Absolutely. Well, cool. Well, thank you guys. Let's see. I'm going to see if we have any questions here. So if you're listening and you have questions, feel free to go ahead and ask those. Let me see. Oh, somebody said that Memory Palace book we were talking about, it's Moonwalking with Einstein. That is the correct title. So yeah, thank you for thank you for remembering that for me. Any podcast recommendations? I guess maybe Billy?
There are a few. One of my absolute most favorites is Wine for Normal People. She just, and I don't know how serendipitously it happened, but she tends to present podcast topics as I'm studying. It's just meant to. But she is brilliant. She goes into great detail, but she's really great teacher in that she can simplify it and make it really easy to digest and connect with. And she's entertaining. So that's, a big plus. Another great one is Wine with Jimmy. Can be a little dry, nice review. And then the webinars, just go back and listen to those. Like I said, when you're driving is a great time. I when I'm in there, just any time that you can. And when I'm working out at the gym in between sets, sleep at night, another great time. Although I usually just review notes or read the text, and I'll put you to sleep.
Yeah, I like those. I mean, one that I like personally is inside winemaking, which is with Jim Dewey, and that gets very much into like the nitty gritty of winemaking and things like that. And we also have we've had students who have also like written their notes and then read their notes out loud and recorded themselves, and then they can listen to their own notes as well, if that's a study technique that might work. For anybody, just mention it. Okay, let me see.
The UK Wine Show is also a good one, and Interpreting Wine is a good podcast as well.
That is a good one. Yeah, I mean, if you're interested in either Santa Barbara or Burgundy right now, Roadside Terroir by Brenna Quigley is really it's a beautiful podcast. It just has music and
Yeah.
So yeah, there are some good ones out there for sure. Let's see. Okay, so I have one question in here. I'm considering taking the diploma remotely. Given we have to take exams in person, did any of you group your exams together to reduce the number of trips to Napa? For example, taking D1 and D2 on the same day. Is it doable or too much? Did any of you guys do that? I can't remember.
I wish I would have. I live in Maine, so it's a hike for me to get out to Napa, which I don't mind. I like going to Napa and drinking wine, but I wish I had done D4 and D5 together. I'm starting to regret not doing that, and I think if you live far away, and it's a cost and a time commitment to travel, it may be a good idea. It's going to be a long test day for you, though, because I contemplated doing D1 and D2 at the same time, but just the thought of sitting in a room for 2.5 hours did not sound pleasant. So.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean,
South America who was doing exactly that, and he seemed to be able to do it, but I will say it does sound very exhausting. Just physically, mentally.
I mean, as the one who like advises students, I would say we do have students do that and who are successful at doing that. It's always just that balance of, cutting out a trip or two to Napa, saves you time, saves you money, but it makes that one exam day more stressful, obviously. So it's always just like balancing those two kind of sides of the scale depending on your specific situation. And I would, if you're thinking of doing that, usually what it looks like is people do D1 and D2 on the same day, or they'll do D4 and D5 on the same day. I always recommend do not do anything else with D3 or you're going to drive yourself crazy. But we do have people who pass both of those exams. I think it's really important to have a good study plan in place, so that you make sure you stay on top of your studying and your scheduling and stuff like that. But it is doable. We have people who succeed. So if you have more questions about that, it looks like your name was Andrew. You're welcome to email me and at diploma@NapaValleyWineAcademy.com. But yeah, I actually think that is all the questions. We were pretty thorough today, so. But yeah, and it's right at 1:00, so that's all we got, guys. Thank you to everybody who joined, and thank you also to our 3 panelists. It was really nice to hear from you guys and hear how students tackle D1 sometimes. Because sometimes when I say something, people are like, whatever, lady. But hearing it from people who have done it, who are students currently in the program, I think is really powerful. So thank you all for joining again. And everybody have a nice day.